which is to say that someone could one day be jihadi Salafi and the next day they are supposedly ISIS, which is even crazier. Who knows? It's unclear is the point. And this sort of situation is too opaque, too difficult to socially engineer from afar and in the training of local proxies. Sorry. That's not very pleasant, is it? I'll wrap up by saying that there's been too much bloodshed, there's been too much destruction, people are just tired throughout. And perhaps that exhaustion is the only path towards getting some kind of resolution. Thank you.
Next we have Dr. Kurt Rhodes, who has spent over 30 years working with and on behalf of marginalized communities and young people across the Middle East. During the 1982 invasion of West Beirut, he volunteered in a community-based clinic alongside students and friends, doing around-the-clock work triage for wounded and ill civilians. That was when the seed idea for Questscope began to take shape. Living and working with people in great suffering propelled him to find a way that he and others in the Middle East could assist the most vulnerable, participating with the voiceless ones in invisible communities.
I can't see you and you can't see me. And it won't be helpful for me to look at your lights because I'm colorblind. So I'm Kurt Rhodes. I started my career in the Middle East at the American University of Beirut in 1981, where I was assistant dean in the School of Public or the Faculty of Health Sciences at the American University of Beirut. In 1982, at the end of the invasion of West Beirut at that time, when the Sabra and Shatila massacres took place, those were all the people that I had served during the time that I had been in Beirut during that war, and it changed the direction of my life. I'm committed, and the people who work with me in my organization are committed to putting the last first. And that has taken us down many, many paths. And I want to share some of the last paths with you this evening. A few of the things that made what we are seeing inevitable, but not inevitably violent, is the fact that in the Middle East we've never ever had so many young people. In the history of the Middle East, we never had so many young people. That has positive and negative consequences. One of the consequences, 5 years ago in the World Bank Conference, a statistic was laid on the table for us that for the Arab region to absorb the new people into the labor force, we would need 9% growth for 10 years. And at that time we looked at each other like, this is a fairy tale? Any country, 9% growth? At the same time, the worst drought in the modern history of Syria took place from 2006 to 2009. And a lot of the things I'm saying to you actually apply to many countries in the world. The misuse of the commons, in this case the use of water and the depletion of the water table, the unregulated use of the commons, and the fact that the profits from that accrued to a small number of people. As one Syrian farmer said, we accept from God's hand the famine. We do not accept what the government did not do for us. One of the key roles of governments in the history of the Middle East is to protect its people in time of famine. This created quite a bit of migration from rural to urban locations. So you can see that something that's almost inevitable is getting ready to happen. The Polish sociologist Ryszard Kapuscinski says, discomfort, trials, difficulties do not create a revolutionary spirit. That happens when you wake up one day and you're no longer afraid. So Syrian youth woke up just like Egyptian youth, woke up just like Tunisian youth, not afraid one day. One of my friends and colleagues, as he discussed what it means to be a young Arab who is not afraid, he He said, my father's generation was blind, uninformed. So he's speaking of those over 50. He said, my generation, the 30s to 50s, were limited, our information was limited by what the government allowed us to know. And what we did learn was filtered or translated by our fathers to us. Be careful, don't raise your head, stick with your family. He said, but the under 30s have access to information, they have access to thought, they have access to others, to see how they think, how they act. He said, really the future depends on, will the older generation give space to the younger generation? The younger generation is discontinuous, but there needs to be some continuity. And he looked at me, he's kind of like you, maybe, he said, I don't think this will happen. Another friend of mine who was a protester in Syria in the 2006, 2007, 2008, he said, we want government. We just didn't want that government, you know? So they're not unruly, unrulable, irregular people. And when the crackdown was apparent that it was going to take place, and these demonstrators moved from city to city, almost like if you go to jazz clubs, it'll appear on your WhatsApp, and you know that for the next 2 hours there'll be jazz on this street, and then WhatsApp will tell you next 2 hours will be on that street. So they created this kind of fairly random looking pattern of being able to meet for protest. And his father was against him. He said, I have lived all my life protecting my family. He said, if you start on this path, you will not be able to protect yourself or your children. And my friend's comment to me later, he said, my father was thinking of his children. He wasn't thinking of his grandchildren. There is hope. The younger generation has it. Will they be able to enact it? You just never know what hope is going to do. The tragedy of violence in Syria, because I lived in Aleppo for 7 years and came to love it. I lived and taught in Damascus, had the privilege to teach preventive medicine to a whole generation of young Syrians who are Syrian physicians now who have come back, especially to Jordan, to serve Syrian refugees. So that's quite a privilege. The tragedy of the violence is that it stems from, I said 3 things: the willingness to destroy, to retain power. Fighting on behalf of another, the proxy violence. And the third is simply making sure that violence happens so that you can do what you want. The young people that I know in Syria, that I have known for the past 35 years, are not willing to destroy to retain power. They are willing to sacrifice so that that won't happen. The proxy violence, where you fight on behalf of someone else. I mean, I lived in Lebanon for 4 years, and each week, different militia would have a different agenda, would have a different fight. As you said, Nabi, the Lebanization of Syria is very dangerous, but it's not an inevitable outcome. Just as a parting comment then, for the past 3 years or longer, you have no education for a generation of Syrians, whether they are refugees in Jordan or Turkey or Lebanon, or whether they are displaced inside their country. So if you couple no education with what I call impoverishment, which does not only include your income, but the rich cultural heritage and relationships and sense of awareness and self-identity that Syrians had, this no education and impoverishment is taking a tremendous toll on normal people who are trying to maintain life. The I know of 200 people who are very active in carrying responsibility for 15,000 internally displaced Syrians. They're just normal people like you and me who, in the middle of this crisis, are willing to give of their time, effort, energies, carrying caseloads for psychosocial counseling, ensuring that children do get some measure of education. There's a lot of good potential on the ground in Syria, but for how long? And that's the frightening part. People cannot go on and on forever being heroes. I believe in Syria, and the Syrians that I know believe in Syria, and we would very much like to turn our attention to the rebuilding of the country from its agriculture to its small business infrastructure to the entrepreneurship that Syrians are known for all over the world. And our great hope is that we have more Syrians who are younger than we've ever had before. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Aronzon, who is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute, where his research focuses on how jihadist groups are adjusting to the new political environment in the era of Arab uprisings and Salafi politics in countries transitioning to democracy. He's also a PhD candidate at King's College of London and a fellow at its Associated International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence.
So today I'm going to be getting a little bit more in the weeds than some of the earlier speakers. I think an important aspect of what's going on in terms of on-the-ground fighting is related to the infighting we've seen in Syria and the northern front over the past 2 months now. So I'm briefly going to describe the background to it and what's been going on and sort of where the state of play is now. So this all began on January 3rd this year, and there are essentially 5 major players. There's the Syrian Revolutionaries Front, which is, you can describe as a nationalist group. You have Jaish al-Mujahideen, which you can describe as sort of garden variety Islamists. Then you have the Islamic Front, which are a spectrum of Salafists, some less radical, some more radical. It's an umbrella organization for about 7 groups. Then you have Jabhat al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda's preferred affiliate within Syria. And lastly, you have the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, also known as ISIS, which is by far the most extreme group and has a lot of similar tendencies that we saw with al-Qaeda in Iraq last decade when the U.S. was involved in the Iraq War. I would say that you have to break up the fighting amongst the rebels in the north into 2 different categories. You sort of have the Syrian Revolutionaries Front and Jaish al-Mujahideen, which are fighting ISIS more for reasons related to ideological purposes, as well as the fact that they want to show that they can take on the jihadist movement within Syria to potentially gain more provisions from the international community, especially from the West. And then I would say that the infighting between the Islamic Front and Jabhat al-Nusra against ISIS is more related to abuses that ISIS has done against those groups, and they're just defending themselves. So within the first month, you essentially had the SRF, the Syrian Revolutionaries Front, and Jaish al-Mujahideen starting to push ISIS out of many areas in the country, including in Idlib and Aleppo. And one of the reasons was because it was a major surprise attack. ISIS was not expecting any of this to happen. But at the time, you had many individuals, especially Syrian activists, getting a little too ahead of themselves in many respects, because they believed that this was going to be the complete downfall of ISIS. And I warned that it would be too early, and unfortunately, I think it has been too early to say that, because they have been able to come back in some ways, though they aren't nearly as strong as they were 2 months ago. There are essentially 4 other reasons why they started to come back. Some of them are, some of it is because some of the rebel groups that were at the local level did not want to fight against ISIS. They did not listen to their commanders. In addition to this, you also saw a bunch of different local ceasefires being struck between ISIS and local battalions. And this is one of the important things to understand about the conflict is even though you have these larger umbrella organizations, under them you have all these smaller battalions and regiments that are more localized in many ways and have some level of independence. And therefore not all these groups are completely cohesive. Another important factor after the ceasefires, which sort of provided a lot of more space for ISIS to start coming back, we saw them taking some more territory back again in Aleppo Governorate, not really in Aleppo City though. And the third reason is because they're able to get a bunch of bayat, or oaths of allegiance, from a number of groups as well as tribal clans within the northern and eastern parts of the country. But one of the things that also happened was that Jabhat al-Nusra was able to get a lot more support also because within the first month of the infighting, they primarily stayed out of it. There was some skirmishes here and there, but it wasn't that large. So one of the things that happened by the second or third week of the infighting is that there was a reconciliation initiative brought to the table by a Saudi sheikh called Dr. Abdullah Muhammad al-Muhaisini. He's very popular within Saudi Arabia, and then last fall, I believe, he entered into Syria and has been living there ever since, doing dawah sessions as well as lectures and the like, and meeting with a bunch of different groups. He created what was called Mubadara al-Ummah, or the Ummah Initiative, to try and bring all 5 of these groups back together and to agree to a resolution so that they weren't killing each other anymore and rather to focus on the regime. It's important to note that in the 2 months of fighting now, about 3,300 rebel fighters have been killed. Those are 3,300 individuals that could have been fighting against the regime instead. And the main idea behind it was to create an independent Sharia court that they can all go to and therefore decide on whatever they decide on. And all the groups, including SRF, Jaish al-Mujahideen, Islamic Front, and Jabhat al-Nusra agreed to this, but ISIS, of course, decided not to. And this created an impasse at the time. After this happened, you then had Al-Qaeda Central in Pakistan release a statement stating that they were disaffiliating itself with ISIS. If you recall, ISIS previously went under the name of Al-Qaeda in Bilad al-Rafidain, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, more so in the mainstream press, in the mid-2000s, but then they changed their name to the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006, and then changed it to the name Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham in April last year when they extended their operations into Syria. In many ways, I know this is very cliche, but I find this quote very apt in terms of the jihadist movement in Syria. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. In many ways, the Syrian war was supposed to be this grand jihad. It breathed life back into the jihadi movement. You had individuals coming again. I mean, you've had about 9,000 Sunni foreign fighters come into Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra was not being abusive in the same way that we saw with Al-Qaeda in Iraq last decade. They were gaining some support on the ground. They were working with other groups. They weren't trying to cannibalize them in the way Al-Qaeda in Iraq did with other Iraqi insurgent forces. So things were looking up, but then ISIS came in and essentially have done the same thing in Syria as they did in Iraq last decade, and they're taking everybody down with them in many respects. So at the beginning of the second month of the infighting, which is about a month ago now, I guess, you sort of had positions being solidified amongst the different rebel groups. You had the SRF primarily in control of Idlib, and ISIS more or less had been kicked out of Idlib. Then you had Jaish al-Mujahideen and the Islamic Front consolidating strength in Aleppo. Jabhat al-Nusra was sort of in all these areas just because they're more of a national group in many respects. And then ISIS themselves have hunkered down in Al-Raqqa province, just to provide a picture of how big Al-Raqqa is. It's actually, the province itself is larger than the size of Kuwait, so ISIS is in control of territory that's larger than the size of Kuwait. But after Al-Qaeda's statement, you started to see leaders within Jabhat al-Nusra calling for ISIS members to defect. And as a result, this of course upset ISIS, so then they started actively fighting against Jabhat al-Nusra. And one of the things we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that each group online has been putting out testimonies of individuals that have defected from each other's fighting groups. So you've had Jabhat al-Nusra guys joining ISIS and then putting out videos saying that Jabhat al-Nusra is really bad, they've been helping out the FSA, they've been helping out the SRF, and the like. And then guys from ISIS have left and joined Jabhat al-Nusra and have put out videos stating, that ISIS was really deceiving fighters. There was a lot of tales allegedly that the commanders were going to say that, you're going out to the battlefield and you're fighting the Assad regime, but then when they get out to the battlefield, they realize that they're actually fighting against other rebel groups, such as the SRF, Islamic Front, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the like. And then what we saw that's really accelerated a lot of the fighting is, I think it's about a week and a half ago now, is that Abu Khalid al-Suri, a senior leader in Ahrar al-Sham, and also Ayman al-Zawahiri's emissary in Syria, being killed by ISIS. And as a result, in response, Jabhat al-Nusra's leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, then released a audio tape and said that he was giving a 5-day ultimatum for ISIS, otherwise it was going to be a full-on war, and that Jabhat al-Nusra would also then create a branch inside of Iraq and destroy them in Iraq as well. And lo and behold, tonight is the end of the 5th day and we still have not heard anything from ISIS. I would not be surprised if they put something out tomorrow just to spite them, to show that they don't need to listen to their deadlines. So this is sort of the state of play in the north now in many respects, in that we've had a lot of infighting over the last 2 months. And this is important in many ways because it's allowed the Assad regime to be able to move back into a lot of areas in Rif Aleppo as well as parts of Aleppo City. I saw on Twitter, I don't know if it was yesterday or 2 days ago, this map of how the Syrian regime has been starting to circle all of Aleppo City, and they've almost completely circled it and are trying to put a siege on it in the same way we've seen with Homs. And part of this is as a result of the fact that lots of these rebel fighting groups have become gutted in many ways because of the infighting and all of the deaths. One of the benefits, potential benefits though, is the fact that as a result of the infighting, it's deterred foreign fighters on the Sunni side from coming in. You see some individuals leaving. You see many, instead of coming in, deciding not to go because they're supposed to go to Syria for what they believe is a lot of Western European Muslims have dubbed it the 5-star jihad. But instead, they're ending up killing each other. The biggest question I personally have now is what happens if ISIS holds on and stays? I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the case that ISIS will be completely defeated because the rebels don't have the same kind of strength that the Iraqi insurgents have with the U.S. military being able to consolidate things. And we also see, as a result of the infighting, that there's now a competition between Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS to see who can do better, also in the Lebanese and Iraqi fronts. So expect those to get even worse as well as a result. So as some of the other panelists, not the prettiest picture, but I suspect that you'll continue to see this infighting for the foreseeable future and probably helping to benefit the Assad regime. Thank you.
Dr. Mark Katz, who is a professor of government and politics at George Mason University. He writes on Russian foreign policy, the international relations of the Middle East, transnational revolutionary movements, and other subjects.
Great, thank you very much. The question I want to address this evening is just why has Moscow backed the Assad regime in Syria so strongly? I have to say I'm a little bit nervous about doing this, only because I talk about this somewhat on the 2:30 panel. I'm afraid I'm going to repeat myself. I shall endeavor not to do that. Why has Russia made such an issue out of Syria? Why has Putin done so in particular? It seems that more than anything else, this appears to be the result of Putin's conviction that it's the right thing to do in foreign policy terms, in Russian domestic political terms, even in moral terms. considerable energy into reasserting Russia's role as a great power, which declined markedly under Gorbachev and Yeltsin. One way in which Putin sought to do this is through restoring Moscow's ties with its Cold War era allies in the Middle East, but these have either not been especially interested, or some of them have actually fallen from power, including Iraq's Saddam Hussein in 2003 and Libya's Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. And as the Carnegie Moscow Center's Dmitry Trenin noted, Russia's stance on Syria is based above all on its leader's largely traditional view of the global order. Keeping Assad in power is Moscow's way of ensuring that it maintains some influence in the Middle East. It's also in Putin's view that the choice is not between authoritarianism and democracy. As far as he's concerned, there's no possibility of democracy in this part of the world. Truth be told, he doesn't believe in democracy anywhere, including here. It's all a sham as far as he's concerned. That the choice is between authoritarian order and chaos, and that he has become, like the czars of old, the arch-conservative, bent on maintaining the established order because that's what keeps chaos at bay. Moscow anticipates that the downfall of Assad will lead to the rise of a radical Sunni regime in Syria that will be anti-Russian as well as anti-Western. Moscow then sees the West as having an interest in seeing that this does not happen, even if not all Western leaders recognize this. And this concern about the rise of Sunni radicals in Syria feeds into Moscow's concern about their possible rise in the Muslim regions of Russia as well as Central Asia. Now, some might argue that local grievances on the part of Russia and Central Asian Muslims may account more for the rise of radicalism among them, and that outside jihadist forces don't need the Assad regime in Syria to fall in order to help them. This isn't how Putin sees things. There are also several factors encouraging Russian support for the Assad regime. The Obama administration's clear unwillingness to become militarily involved in Syria or provide much support to the opposition has given a greater degree of freedom for Moscow to support Assad, and can be seen, it is seen in Moscow as an indication that Washington too fears that the downfall of Assad will lead to the rise of a radical Sunni regime in Syria, but Washington doesn't want to say so. President Obama's threat of a military strike at Syria in response to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons against its opponents last August was a departure from this pattern, but Obama's seeking congressional authorization, Congress's obvious unwillingness to grant it, and Obama's quick acceptance of the Russian proposal to place Syria's chemical weapons under international control all showed Moscow and many others that Obama still does not want to intervene. There's also, in my view, the Israeli factor. Despite the Assad regime's hostility toward Israel, its alliance with Iran, and its support for Hezbollah, Moscow understands that Israel also fears that the downfall of Assad will lead to a far more hostile regime or situation in Syria. Moscow sees Israel as something of an ally in urging